The Brontes. Just as with the transition from the classical Mozart to the romantic Beethoven in music, or in poetry, following the poetry of Dryden and Pope, there is the appearance of William Blake, then William Wordsworth and Percy Bysshe Shelley, marking the arrival of a more overt sentiment in poetry. So the novels of the Bronte sisters occupy a special romantic place. The novels of the Bronte sisters are an unequalled collection of artistic achievement for any family. They are so in both some of the neglected works as well as the celebrated ones. The Bronte sisters were raised in Yorkshire, the daughters of a clergyman who had changed his name to Bronte with an E from a Y on leaving Ireland before attending St John's College, Cambridge, after which he struggled to find a position until he eventually moved to Yorkshire. The contrast of origin with the socially elevating potential of education and reading were part of the established family lore of their upbringing, which would come to feature in their fiction, as would the proximity they experienced between both the rough and the sophisticated, the limited cottage and its library of open imagination, and the pull between these opposites and social obligations on the one hand, and natural desires on the other, which would be such a central motif of the works of Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre. There is a TV dramatisation of the biography of the lives of the Bronte family called To Walk Invisible, made in 2016. Charlotte Bronte had written about her time abroad in Brussels as a young teacher in the work The Professor, but it was rejected by the publisher. Meanwhile, her sister Emily's Wuthering Heights and Anne's Agnes Grey had been accepted. Determined to reverse this setback, Charlotte took advice from Emily to include more gothic and passionate elements, pace and clearer turning points in plot, and for Anne on writing from the point of view of a young teacher in England as a character. And so while on a trip to Liverpool to seek medical help for her father's failing eyesight, Charlotte determinedly set to work, in a relatively short and concentrated time, to write what is considered by many, and certainly many English teachers, to be a favourite and one of the most acclaimed novels of all time, Jane Eyre, not least due to its examples of the reforming and healing potential of virtuous judgment enacted patiently with understanding over time. Jane Eyre is the story of a near orphan sent by her unsympathetic aunt to a girls' school where she learns to be a governess, so she can take a job at Thornfield Hall, where she meets Mr. Rochester. On discovering that Mr. Rochester's first wife is hidden in the attic and out of her mind, Jane sets out alone and penniless onto the Yorkshire moor. She is rescued by a young clergyman, but when she rejects his offer of marriage and a life as a missionary in India, she is told that she has been left money by her uncle. Now with independent means, she returns to Thornfield Hall to find it burnt to the ground by Bertha Mason, Mr. Rochester's first wife, who has died in the fire. Having lost a hand and his eyesight, Jane finds Edward in the nearby cottage, and together they start a family in a garden of natural beauty, and his sight in one eye returns. It is a story of redemption. For all the disadvantages and misfortunes experienced by Jane, her nature and attitude is that of a patient understanding of others and to seek what is right. It is a companion guide on how to relate to the world. The reader is educated as the central character matures. Instead of the powerless but sympathetic and eloquent victim of Richardson's Clarissa, Jane transforms the bad to good by her example in a story of pain and healing. The novel models the importance of example, of integrity, of pure intention, of meaning well, of forgiveness. This is no mere superficial optimism of attitude, as might be written in some lesser works of today, as it is by no means naive, as the novel's treatment of child death, social alienation, mortal disease, violent knife attack, insanity, trickery, snobbery, and misfortune attest. But Jane, by example, influences events for the good. One of the many acts of genius is that none of the characters is wholly bad or wholly good. All are understandable in human terms. Even the attitude of the aunt, Mrs. Reed, is understandable as someone traumatised by the death of her husband and subsequently unable to order and discipline her children, and particularly her son, who ironically, by sending Jane away, gives her an advantage over her own children by sending Jane to an environment in which she can learn to earn her living. A harsh practicality that she unwittingly denies her own. Omitted from many dramatic adaptations is that after the the death of the fellow student Helen Burns, Mr. Brocklehurst is exposed for running down Lowood Institute with poor food and heating. When the management is put into the hands of Miss Temple, the orphanage is reformed as a prefiguration of the later reform of Thornfield Hall and Mr. Rochester by Jane. Names have a special symbolic value in the book, as the aunt with the library is Mrs. Reed. Jane is air, an unusual word evoking the element air or spirit, while being reminiscent of Aries or fairies of supernatural power for Edmund Spenser's Elizabethan the Fiery or Fairy Queen. The inspiring teacher and reformer is a Miss Temple. Realising lessons from the more discursive and leaden the professor for Jane Eyre, the pacing and surprises are cleverly paced, and there are regular clear major events and turning points, giving the novel a compelling narrative structure in 5 acts. The aunts, the orphanage, the hall of Mr. Rochester, the flight to St. John, and the return to the hall. The Gothic elements, the attempted fire, the noises in the attic, the walk up the stairs by candlelight, the stabbing of Mr. Mason, the rain and skies of the moor when Jane faces the elements alone, and the supernatural voice that carries Jane back to Rochester from across the moor as his soul cries out in pain, all generate a deep, passionate involvement in the natural world that is less present in Charlotte's other more cerebral works, and a sense of personal meaning and development. I have never known anyone complete the reading of Jane Eyre without being impressed, saying that it is a good story, a credible redemption that we can believe in, gained not by assertion or identity or attitude, but by example. As a guide to right view and how the agency of even the quietest voice can influence the world for the better, and a reminder of the power each of us have in our hands for good or evil, this novel of the early 19th century has a moral and social purpose and value which in so many ways today's fiction, particularly that which seeks to be published for the sake of being published, can often be said to lack. Charlotte's sisters died while they were young, and Emily only completed 1 novel and Anne 2. On the back of the success of Jane Eyre, Charlotte rushed to write Shirley, but it was not well received, as the good judgment of Jane Eyre deserted her. And the work appears rushed, less well thought through, less appealing, less reworked under a sister's critical glare. Finally, Villette is a partial return to form, as Charlotte considers English and European relations, differences and a common future. It is surprisingly relevant today, as Charlotte shows the understanding of European culture and history missing from some more contemporary media discourse. Nevertheless, its observations and dialogues, however interesting, cannot recapture the Gothic revelations in what is widely regarded as one of the greatest novels. If Jane Eyre is the ultimate English teacher's novel for educational purposes and study and appreciation of quality and purpose of fiction, so then does her sister Emily's work constitute the next, more adult stage of life. If birth, fortune, marriage, human love and social redemption form the nature of Jane Eyre, so romantic love, the wildness of human passion, the tragedy of the unfair hand of fate and the haunting nature of death and missed opportunity form the nature of its more wild and passionate sibling, Wuthering Heights. The death scene of Catherine, where she declares a love for Heathcliff beyond life and death and the limitations of the natural world to punch a hole into a greater reality, is surely one of the most haunting of all dialogues ever put down on page. One is left with the impression that it must have been based on the living death speeches of those she knew. It must be said that the second half of the book can hardly live up to the intensity of the first, but the first is the most intense story of human passion ever set down in words. What happens is that, rather more formally, the subsequent generation of Catherine Jr., as it were, and her lover achieved the ordered marriage that the previous generation so tempestuously could not. That the violation of the human heart by foolish choices can set out a chain of events and repercussions that force seismic waves into the nature of reality out, surviving the lives of those who participated, is not only how we may see life, but it also may be the point of view from Wuthering Heights itself that sees many inhabitants come and go, as we are the dwelling's temporary inhabitants. The memories and loves and passions of others linger on in an unnerving power on the lives of following generations. In the 19th century, overshadowed by her sister's works, but rising continually in critical acclaim and appreciation since that time, is Anne Bronte's Agnes Grey, a fascinating account of the experience of teaching at that time. It has a veracity and eloquence that is striking. It is the novel of a young woman growing up, but its inferiority to Jane Eyre is that the changes in the story do not appear to change her character, as the focus of the work is on the observation of others. And it is this weakness in the dynamic possibility of a novel that is later corrected by her sister Charlotte when she writes her governess Jane, with Agnes Grey setting out the possibilities that would be realised dramatically, psychologically, thematically in Jane Eyre. It is a sort of air. We can imagine Charlotte reading Agnes Grey and pondering on repositioning the governess socially in England for her new story rather than the Brussels of the professor, and making the protagonist the teacher, while another sister implored Charlotte to let her characters show the incremental change that events and emotions had upon them, especially in the life of the heroine, that her first work omitted, and Emily urging the importance of the unrestrained and restricted passion of human love of her Heathcliff and Cathy, that Charlotte's first work, The Professor, was so restrained as to admit. Thus, in spirit, both the invisible and the visible walk together in Jane Eyre. It should also be said that this intensification process would also be taken up by Anne in her second novel. Anne's second novel is genuinely one of the most prescient of fictional works. Although it was written in the 1830s, Anne gives us, in realistic terms, in the second part of a three-part book, the details of just what it was like to live in an abusive and unhappy marriage. So against the grain of the time, so defiant of customs and sentimental beliefs of how marriage should be presented, so revolutionary, insisting on the validity of real human emotion and experience as actually lived, rather than how they ought to be for appearances, can hardly be stated. It is like the prose of the documentarians of the 1930s, 100 years earlier, or the origin of the dialogue of the soap operas of the 1950s. As the wife, she is the tenant, the temporary dweller, and never the owner. The book is in three parts as a triptych, and the first part, from one of the male relatives' point of view, is somewhat forgettable and in reality unnecessary. It may have been written to prepare the reader for the challenging originality of the tale of domestic distress that was to follow. Not until A Taste of Honey in the 1950s would there be such a graphic portrayal of the inner turmoil of a family's living room, and its betrayals and castigations and intense waves of love and hate and burning, unredeemable injustice. I should also add that the triptych structure does prefigure Into the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, which has a similar critique of marriage. The final third of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall returns to a male point of view to continue the story to its conclusion so the drama can reach its inevitable and bitter end. As A Raisin in the Sun was a sea change in New York theatre in the 1950s, so could The Tenant of Wildfell Hall have been to the novel in the 1830s, but ahead of its time it was rejected as improper, crude, and dangerous. Subsequent generations have taken a different view and appreciate the novel's unique position in the arts to relate effectively experience that only over 100 years later could be fully appreciated.